Good afternoon, class. So this will be our first online lecture. So until we start regular classes, we will be doing online lectures. And this is our first online lecture. So I know a lot of you may have questions about what material you're going to be responsible for. Essentially, we are still covering the same material as the previous class schedule, but I will give you an updated class schedule with new dates because we had a week additional of spring break. So essentially that's going to push back our dates a week for everything. Also, with online classes, it'll give you flexibility to watch the lectures whenever you are available. And also I will try to have, I will plan to have my office hours during our regular class time. So, and I'm going to use Microsoft Teams for office hours, but I will have them from 6 through 7, Monday and Wednesday. And I will put that in the class schedule. So we left off we were still talking about chapters 6, 7, and 8. And we've actually already discussed chapters 6 and 7 in our normal class. So we're on slide 132 now. And essentially slide 132 starts with, we're on slide 132, and that is the beginning of chapter 8, and chapter 8 deals with joints. So joints are essentially the articulation of bones. So all that means is that the sites where two or more bones meet. And essentially, the function of joints is to hold bones together and allow for mobility. And there are two ways that we classify joints. You can classify joints based on their function, and that essentially means the amount of movement allowed at the joint. You can also classify joints based on their structure. And essentially, the structure is going to be the material that holds the bones together at the joints. So you have three different types of binding materials, and we're going to talk about each one of them in more detail. But they are essentially fibrous joints where the fibrous material, collagen, is going to bind the bones together. Cartilage is going to bind the joints together. And then you have synovial joints, and synovial joints are the only joints that have a cavity. Okay, and they're going to be filled with synovial fluid. The functional classification of joints talks about the amount of movement allowed at the joint. So you have essentially three types of classifications for the functional classification. Synarthrosis, those are going to be your immovable joints. Okay, and then you have amphiarthrosis, slightly movable joints, and diarthrosis, freely movable joints. Your freely movable joints are going to be predominantly found in the appendicular skeleton, your limbs, whereas your immovable and slightly movable joints are going to be largely found in the axial skeleton. In general, remember, the less movable a joint is, the more support it's going to provide. So it makes sense to find your immovable joints in your axial skeleton, whereas you find your freely movable joints in the appendicular skeleton. All right, because those are your limbs, and your limbs are used for movement, so that makes sense. The most common way to classify joints is structurally, and you have three classifications structurally. You have fibrous joints, which are generally immovable. And then you have cartilage joints, which is kind of in between. They're either immovable or slightly movable. And then you have synovial joints, which are freely movable. And just be aware that fibrous and cartilage joints do not have a cavity. The only type of joint that has a cavity is the synovial joints. And we will talk about each three of these structural classification of joints in the next couple of slides. In fibrous joints, the bones are joined by collagen fibers. Again, no joint cavity is present, and the amount of movement depends on the length of the connective fibers, but in general, most fibrous joints are immobile. There are three types of fibrous joints. You have sutures. The only place you're going to find sutures is the skull, and sutures are immobile. We'll talk about more about each one of these on the next couple of slides where they have pictures. But again, they're immobile, and that's going to be for protection. And also, when it talks about fibrous joints, remember you have collagen fibers, which are connecting the bones to each other. And the shorter the collagen fibers, the less movement. The longer the collagen fibers, the more movement. All right, so sutures have very short collagen fibers. Syndesmoses. So these are going to be fibrous joints that are going to be connected by ligaments. And essentially, a ligament is a fibrous connective tissue that connects bones to other bones. If the collagen fibers are short, they're going to be longer than sutures. Sutures are the shortest collagen fibers. So with the syndesmoses, the collagen fibers are going to be longer than the sutures, but they're still going to be, well, it depends. If it's going to be like an example of the ligaments joining the fibula and tibia together, those are going to be relatively short, so it's going to be immobile. But you do have examples of longer syndesmosis collagen fibers, ligaments, which would be in between your radius and your ulna. You know how you can move your radius and your ulna. That's going to be longer collagen fiber, so that allows for that movement between your radius and your ulna. And then the last type of fibrous joint is gymphosis, and essentially this is only found in your teeth. And we're going to talk about this when we get to the picture. But again, this is going to be only found in your teeth, and it's going to be short collagen fibers, and it's going to be immobile. Here's an image of sutures. And again, sutures are only found in the skull. And if you look at the image, to me, sutures look just like stitches. And again, these are very short collagen fibers holding the articulations of the flat bones of your skull together. And essentially, when you start off as an embryo, and then as you grow, your skull has to continue to grow. So it still has fibrous connective tissue in the sutures, but then as you get into middle age, the fibrous tissue is going to ossify, and the skull bones are going to fuse into a single unit. And again, the reason why you don't want any movement in your skull, essentially it protects your brain. So if the skull was able to move, then that's going to increase the likelihood of the brain getting damaged. And again, sutures are very short collagen fibers. The other picture is an example of the syndesmosis joint. And with this syndesmosis joint, The bones are connected exclusively by ligaments, okay? And again, the shorter the ligaments, the less movement occurs, and the longer the ligaments, or the longer the fibrous connective tissue, the more movement will be allowed. And the picture that's up right now is a picture of the ligament holding the fibula and tibia together. And this is a relatively short collagen fibers. And again, it's longer than sutures because sutures are the shortest. But it's still relatively short. Longer than sutures, but still relatively short. So at this position, essentially, it's going to be immobile. But if you also have a ligament that connects your ulna and radius bones together, all right, in your arm, and essentially in your forearm. So essentially, that ligament is actually longer. Okay, so that allows for more movement. All right, in your forearm between your radius and your ulna. Okay, so I just wanted to give you an example of both. One that has generally no movement between the fibula and tibia, because it has short ligament, short collagen fibers. But then also you have longer collagen fibers between the radius and ulna, all right, which allows for movement, okay, of your forearm in that location. The last example of a fibrous joint is gum phosis, and that is a peg and socket fibrous joint. And the only example is the articulation of a tooth with its bony alveolar socket. And essentially, the term gumphosis comes from a Greek term gumpho, meaning nail or bolt. So that refers to the way that teeth look as if they were hammered into their socket. Okay, and the fibrous connective tissue in this case is the short periodontal ligaments. You see those very short periodontal ligaments. Okay, so those are the fibrous connective tissue, and they're short, so they're going to be immobile. It's going to be an immobile joint. The next type of joint we're going to talk about is cartilaginous joints. So there are two types of cartilaginous joints, synchondrosis and symphysis, and we're going to talk about each one in more detail on the next couple of slides. But in general, cartilaginous joints are the articulating bones united by cartilage. And just like fibrous joints, they do not have a cavity, so they lack a joint cavity, and they are not very movable. The synchondrosis is immobile. That word, synarthrotic, that means that essentially all that means is that the synchondrosis joints are immobile, okay? And then with the symphysis joints, it's slightly movable. And again, we're going to talk about both of them in the next few slides in more detail. This diagram or schematic illustrates synchondrosis cartilaginous joints. And with synchondrosis joints, you have a bar or plate of hyaline cartilage unites the bones. So if you remember, you see an example here at the epiphyseal plate. So remember when you're young and you're going through, adolescence, that epiphyseal plate is where the long bones are going to be growing. All right, and then that's going to be temporarily joined by hyaline cartilage. But then as you get older, once you finish with puberty, the epiphyseal plate seals, and then it's, growth is no longer capable. But again, at the epiphyseal plate, that's where you can find an example of synchondrosis joint, and it's going to be united by hyaline cartilage. Another example of a synchondrosis joint is the immovable joint between the costal cartilage of the first rib and the manubrium of the sternum. And if you look at figure B, which it doesn't have it labeled as B, but if you look at this figure right here, where it has you see the sternum and you see that first rib, and you see the joint right there between the costal cartilage of the first rib and the manubrium of the sternum. Okay, that's a synchondrosis joint. And then they have it up at C, they have it highlighted, or they have it zoomed in so you can see that figure even better. And you can see again, it's hyaline cartilage between the sternum and the first rib right there. This figure shows the second type of cartilaginous joints, the symphysis joint. And with the symphysis joint, you have fibrocartilage that is uniting the bones together. And the thing about fibrocartilage is that it is compressible and resilient, so it can act as a shock absorber, and it permits a limited amount of movement at the joint. With the symphysis joint, it is amphiarthrotic, meaning you have slight movement. Again, amphiarthritic means slight movement at the joints. So it's designed for strength, and it's also designed to be flexible. And the two locations that you find the symphysis joint is going to be the intervertebral joints. You see right here, the intervertebral joints. You have fibrocartilage found there, and also at the pubic symphysis. At the pubic symphysis, you have fibrocartilage holding the two bones of the pubic together at the pubic symphysis. Now we move on to the third type of classification of joints is the synovial joints. So synovial joints are those in which the articulating bones are separated by a fluid containing joint cavity. Again, these are the only types of joint that have a cavity, and synovial fluid is found in the joint cavity. And you can think of the synovial fluid, it acts as a lubricant, okay? Because at the synovial joints, they are going to be freely movable. So essentially the arrangement of the bones in this joint cavity permits a lot of freedom. Okay, so remember these terms that we talked about. So with freely movable, if a joint is freely movable, we use the term diarthrosis. But just to review also, if a joint is not movable, which we talked about with the fibrous joints, okay, we use the term synarthrosis when there's no movement. And then in the last cartilaginous joints that we just got through talking about, remember we talked about them slightly movable amphiarthrosis. Okay, so just a recap on those terms. And we will talk about synovial joints in more detail in the next few slides. These next few slides show the location of some synovial joints. So this one is showing the shoulder joint, ball and socket shoulder joint. And you can see that it is multi-axial joint. So essentially we're going to talk about this in more detail, but you do need to know the difference between multi-axial, non-axial, biaxial, uniaxial. But multi-axial just means that it can move in all three planes. So your ball and socket joint can move in all three planes. You also see in this ball and socket joint, multi-axial joint, you can see the articular cartilage, which is made out of hyaline cartilage. And you can also see the articular capsule. But again, this is just showing you the location of different places synovial joints are found. This slide right here is also showing you another location where you find synovial joints at your elbow. Okay, your elbow joint, and that's a uniaxial joint. So uni means one, so that's movement in one plane. Okay, and then you have your articular cartilage that you can see. All right, made out of hyaline cartilage, and then you can see your articular capsule right there. Okay, and you see your radius and ulna and your humerus. Okay, and then another example of synovial joints, they're showing you the intercarpal joints of the hand. So with the intercarpal joints of the hand, they are biaxial. So bi means two. So there's movement in two planes in a biaxial joint. So your intercarpal joints are biaxial. And again, you see the radius and ulna. And you can see your carpals, and you see the blue that's highlighted in between your carpals. Those are your intercarpal joints. Okay? And again, those are synovial joints, and they are biaxial, meaning there's movement in two planes. There are 6 features of synovial joints. One feature is that they have articular cartilage. So essentially at the end, so remember when something articulates, it means it meets at two places. So where the joints meet, essentially at the ends of the bones, they're covered with hyaline cartilage. Okay, that's the articular cartilage. It is hyaline cartilage. All right, and then you also are going to have an articular capsule that's going to surround the joint cavity. So the articular capsule has 2 layers. It has a tough external fibrous layer, and that's composed of dense and irregular connective tissue. And it also has internal to the fibrous layer, you have a synovial membrane, which is composed of loose connective tissue. And the synovial membrane function is to make synovial fluid. Okay, so again, the articular capsule has 2 layers. Okay, it has a tough external fibrous layer, and internal to the fibrous layer you have the synovial membrane, and the synovial membrane is what makes the synovial fluid. All right, so again, you have a joint cavity is listed as number 3, and again, a cavity is what it is a cavity, and essentially it's a potential space, because certain times you may have more synovial fluid than others. Okay, so like during inflammation, you tend to have an increase of synovial fluid that can produce swelling, and at those joints during inflammation. So the joint cavity is a potential space because it can be not much synovial fluid there too. It can have an increased amount of synovial fluid depending on movement and also depending on inflammation. And number 4, synovial fluid. The synovial fluid is formed or is derived largely by the filtration from blood flowing through the capillaries in the synovial membrane. The synovial fluid has a viscous consistency due to the hyaluronic acid secreted by cells in the synovial membrane. If you remember when we talked about connective tissue, hyaluronic acid essentially makes like a gel-like matrix in a connective tissue. So the synovial fluid is viscous because it contains hyaluronic acid secreted by cells in the synovial membrane. And the synovial fluid provides a slippery, weight-bearing film that reduces friction between the cartilage. And without this lubricant, essentially, the rubbing or the movement of your joints, movement of your bones at these joints will rub away and destroy the joint tissue. Okay, and actually, osteoarthritis is when the articular cartilage wears away, and essentially you don't have that hyaline cartilage to help protect, the impact and compression at the joints, and pain occurs because of that. But also, if you don't have synovial fluid, that's going to allow that pretty much osteoarthritis to occur. It's going to allow the articular cartilage to be worn away. The synovial fluid also contains phagocytic cells that rid the joint cavity of microbes and cellular debris. The fifth feature of synovial joints, you have three possible types of reinforcing ligaments. So you have a capsular ligament, and essentially the capsular ligaments are usually thickened parts of the fibrous layer of the capsule. So the green is the synovial membrane. So external to the synovial membrane is your fibrous external layer. So that will be where the capsular ligaments, reinforcing ligaments, will be found. And then you have extracapsular, meaning they're going to be outside the capsule, ligaments. And then you have intracapsular ligaments. And your examples of intracapsular ligaments, when you hear athletes talk about tearing their ACL, so you have an anterior cruciate ligament, and you have a posterior cruciate ligament that are essentially deep to the capsule, and they form like a cross in the internal part of the capsule, and essentially they essentially still provide reinforcement in the knee. And again, you hear a lot of times with sports injuries, the ACL getting torn, and that is a intracapsular ligament. The last feature of synovial joints are nerve and blood vessel supply. Synovial joints are richly supplied with sensory nerve fibers that innervate the capsule. Some of these fibers detect pain, but most monitor your position and stretch. So that's going to be important for maintaining our posture and body movements. And synovial joints are also richly supplied with blood vessels, and most of which supply the synovial membrane. And remember, the synovial membrane is responsible for making the synovial fluid. And you should check out the YouTube video. Just click the link in the PowerPoint. So we have gotten through talking about the 6 general features of synovial joints, but you also have some features of synovial joints that are not technically part of a synovial joint, but they're closely associated with them. And 2 of those features are bursa and tendon sheaths. So the bursa is essentially, you can think of the bursa you see right here, bursa right there. You can think of that as a bag of lubricant. All right, and again, that's going to be important to reduce the friction between adjacent structures during joint activity. Bursa are essentially flattened fibrous sacs lined with synovial membrane, which is going to secrete a thin film of synovial fluid. And you're going to find bursa in places where ligaments, muscle, skin, tendons, or bones rub together. Okay, so again, think of bursa as a bag of lubricant. All right, and essentially your tendon sheath. So you see your bursa right here. You see how it's green, and then you see your tendon sheath right here. You see how that's also green. So your tendon sheath is essentially an elongated bursa that wraps completely around a tendon, subjected to friction. So the tendon sheath's gonna be essentially an elongated bursa that wraps around a tendon subject to friction. Think of it like a bun wrapping around a hot dog. And tendon sheaths are common where several tendons are crowded together within narrow canals. So again, this figure is showing you two features that are often associated with synovial joints, but aren't technically a part of a synovial joint, but they're usually a lot of times associated with them, which is bursa and tendon sheath. So now we're going to talk about the range of motion of synovial joints. And again, we're going to go over in the next few slides examples of each one of these, and where you can see locations of each one of these. But non-axial, this is your slipping movements only, also a lot of times referred to as gliding movements. Non-axial. Uniaxial is going to be movement in one plane. Biaxial is going to be movement in two planes. And multi-axial is going to be movement in or around all three planes. And again, these next couple of slides are going to show examples of each one of these range of motions, and also locations where you can find them. And these are locations that you should be familiar with, which are, test questions possible. So you should know these locations. And we will go through some other part of those slides where it will actually have boxes around certain locations or certain terms that you need to know also, but we'll talk about that when we get there. This figure shows you you see all the different movements: non-axial, uniaxial, biaxial, multi-axial, and they're color coordinated. And again, you do need to know the locations of these different movements. And you see right here the non-axial. I will call that kind of a pinkish color right here. All right, and the non-axial is an example of gliding movements, and they occur when one flat or nearly flat bone surface glides or slips over another. Think of the side-to-side motion, and this happens without rotation or angulation or increasing or decreasing angle. And the gliding movements occur at the intercarpal, and this figure is showing the intercarpal joint. It also occurs in the intertarsal joints, which would be in your foot, and between the flat articular processes of the vertebrae. All right, that's where you find non-axial movement or gliding movement. This figure shows you an example of uniaxial movement, and you see right here, color coordinated, dark blue, and you see it right here at your elbow, which is, you can compare that to a hinge joint. So remember, uniaxial movement is movement in one plane. Okay, so again, hinge joint, you get that movement in one plane at your elbow. All right. Another example of uniaxial movement would be the when the ulna and radius do the essentially when you through your forearm from when you have supination, when your palms are up, and then you go move your hand from supination to pronation when your palms are down. Okay, that's going to be due to the pivot movement between the ulna and the radius. And if you remember from a basketball analogy, your pivot foot is the foot that stays on the floor, and then you can move your other leg, okay, but your pivot foot stays on the touching the floor, but the other foot can move off the floor. In this case, it's going to be your radius that rotates over your ulna when you do pronation. So when you go from supination to pronation, meaning from your palms up to your palms down, your radius is going to rotate over the ulna. Okay, so that's the example of a pivot joint, and essentially that's also an example of uniaxial movement in one plane. On this figure, we see an example. You see the teal green example of a biaxial joint. So remember, biaxial means movement in two planes. All right, so the metacarpal phalangeal joint, which is what's highlighted in this figure, that is an example of a biaxial movement. And again, with this kind of movement, you have movement in two planes. So that's be flexing and extension, and also sideways. Moving sideways is allowed at this metacarpal phalangeal joint. Another example of a biaxial movement would be the metacarpal joints of the thumb. So this figure is highlighting the metacarpal joints of the thumb, and this is also an example of biaxial movement. So at this joint, you're allowed to do flexion and extension, and you also do adduction and abduction. And on the last slide, I said sideways movement. I should have used the scientific terms and should have said adduction and abduction. And we're going to talk more about what those mean, adduction and abduction. But the two movements for this saddle joint are flexion and extension, and adduction and abduction. And for the condylar joint or the metacarpal phalangeal wrist joint that we got through talking about in this previous slide, again, the two movements are flexion and extension, adduction and abduction. Okay, and then on this saddle joint, the metacarpal joint of the thumbs, you have flexion and extension, adduction and abduction. Okay, those are the two movements. And this figure illustrates the multi-axial movement, and this is kind of a yellow color right here, multi-axial. And this is an example of ball and socket joint. So with a multi-axial, you have movement in three planes. You can do flexion and extension, adduction and abduction. You also have rotation. So you have movement in all three planes with a multi-axial movement. Flexion and extension, adduction and abduction, and rotation. Okay, movement in all three planes, and commonly known as a ball and socket joint. And here is a link for the YouTube video. Please take your time and check that out. In the next couple of slides, It's gonna be a summary chart. But this chart's gonna tell you, and this is you do need to know this: the joint names, the articulating bones, the structural classification, the functional classification, and the movements allowed. And again, you need to know you do need to know the joint names, the articulating bones, structural classifications, functional classifications, and movements allowed. And as you can see on this table, you have certain joints that are in a box, in like an orange red box, or actually we'll call it red, a red box. Okay. All right. So obviously anything circled in one of these red box, you definitely should know the name of the joint, the articulating bones, the structural classification, functional classification, and the movements allowed. Okay, so anything in these red boxes you should definitely know. You should really try to know everything, but you should definitely make sure you know the joints that are in the red boxes. Okay, so if we go to the next slide, you see some more joint types that are in red boxes. Again, these red boxes, anything in red is something that you should definitely know for the test. Okay, and some of these we have talked about, some of these we may not have talked about. Like in the slide previously, they had the temporal mandibular joint. Okay, we didn't talk about that, but this table still summarizes it for you. Okay, so you should still know the articulating bones, the structural type, and the functional type. Okay, it still summarizes it for you. But most of these we did talk about. Shoulder, elbow, wrist, intercarpal, metacarpal, phalangeal. We talked about all of those already. But again, this table summarizes it. It has everything so that you can see everything that you need to know in one place. All right, it summarizes it for you. And then the hip joint, knee, ankle. Again, some of these we may not have talked about, but they still is in this chart. It still summarizes for you. It's still information that's also in your book. Just for time constraint, we can't talk about every joint, but we went over examples of each one, and these are just fall into those same categories of what we've already talked about. Okay, but again, it's in red, so you need to know the name of the joint, articulating bones, structural type, functional type, and movements allowed. Okay. So now we're going to talk about a little bit more detail about the movements at the synovial joints. So again, you have your gliding movements, angular movements, and rotation. And we already talked about, gliding movements. Examples, your intercarpal joints. All right, so we already, talked about that, gliding motion. So let's talk about the angular movements. So with the angular movement, you're going to either increase or decrease an angle between two bones. There are different ways that you can do that. You can do flexion, extension, hyperextension, abduction, adduction, circumduction. And again, we're going to go into more detail each one of those. There are figures, and I think it'd be better to talk about it with the figure. And then the third type, rotation, turning the bone around its own long axis. And again, we talked about your shoulder with rotation, able to do that. And just because we are on this slide and it has an example of, gliding motion at the intercarpal joints, remember that gliding motion is an example of non-axial movement. So just remember that gliding motion example of non-axial movement, and it usually occurs between relatively flat bones. Okay, so let's move on to the next slide. All right, so with your angular movements, so when you flex, you decrease the angle between the joint. So when you make a muscle, all right, you're flexing your arm. Okay, that's flexing. Then extension is going to increase the angle of the joint. Most joints don't like to extend, hyperextend. Okay, excessive extension between normal range of motion. So when you hyperextend, a lot of times you can end up with some kind of sport injury. And this next slides have picture examples of each. All right, so again, flex on. In this case, she's bending downward, decreasing the angle. Extension, she's standing straight from her flexing position, standing up. And then hyperextension is going further back. Okay, and she's also doing it with her neck. Okay, she's doing the same thing with her neck that she was doing with her waist. All right. This figure just has more examples of flex on and extension at the shoulder and knee. Okay. So another angular movement is abduction, movement away from the midline, adduction, movement toward the midline, and circumduction is just pretty much a circular movement. So the way I like to try to remember the difference between abduction and adduction, when you add something, like when you do an addition, you're adding two things up. So I think of what adduction, and again, it's just something I came up with in my head. You can come up with your own way to remember this, but you're moving it toward your body. So moving, like if you're moving your arms toward your body, you can think of that as adding, addition, plus one or whatever. That's the way I kind of put it in my head, just make it easy for me to remember. Then abduction is the opposite. You're moving away from the midline. And then circumduction, so again, pretty much describes moving in a circular motion. Okay, at the distal end, usually of your limbs, you can move your in a circular motion. Okay, also described as a cone in space, but that's circumduction. This figure again shows an example of abduction, you moving away from the midline, adduction toward the midline, okay, and then circumduction, circular motion, and in this case, circumduction of the upper limb at the shoulder, okay, goes in a circular motion, circumduction. This figure is showing rotation, which is the turning of a bone around its own axis. So in your neck, the first two cervical vertebrae is the only movement allowed between C1 and C2. And also showing in this figure, you can have rotation may be directed toward the midline or away from it. So in this case, you have medial rotation of the thigh. The femur's anterior surface moves toward the median plane of the body, and then you have lateral rotation, which is the opposite movement. This slide talks about special movements at synovial joints: supination, pronation, dorsiflexon, plantar flexon, inversion, eversion, protraction, retraction, elevation, depression, opposition. And we're going to talk about each one of these with the corresponding figure or corresponding picture, because it's easier to visualize when you can see a picture. So let's talk about each one of them. in the next few slides. Okay, so supination is essentially when your palms are facing upward. So if you have your hand and your palms are facing upward, that's supination. When you turn your hand, where your palms are facing downward, okay, that's going to be pronation. All right. And I believe there is a figure of it right here. Okay, so again, supination, palms are facing upward. Pronation, palms are facing downward. Okay. Now, movements of the foot, dorsiflexon and plantar flexon. So remember your vocabulary. Remember, dorsi means back. Okay, so the dorsal part of your foot is the back part of your foot. When I should put it like this, it's the top part of your foot. Okay, so on your foot you have your top part. It's technically the back of your. When you talk about your foot, I'm sorry, I'm not trying to confuse you, but let me go to the picture so it's just more clear. All right, you see right here, I'm calling this the back part of your foot, dorsal part of your foot. Okay, and then what's a little bit confusing when I use the word back and I use the word bottom. You know, sometimes you want to think they're the same thing. In this case, when I'm talking about the bottom, I'm talking about the plantar part of your foot. Okay, so essentially with the dorsiflexon, remember flexing is you are decreasing the angle. So this is the dorsal part of your foot. If you're flexing that, then you're essentially pointing your foot upward. Okay, and then this is your plantar part of your foot, the bottom of your foot. And if you are flexing the plantar part of your foot, remember when you flex something, you decrease the angle. Okay, so you're pointing your foot downward when your plantar flex on. Okay, and again, it's really simple, but the way I remember it, remember dorsal means back. This is the back part of your foot. Okay, dorsal flexon, you're flexing your foot upward to make that dorsal part decreasing the angle. And then the plantar is the bottom part of your foot. Okay, plantar flexon, you're decreasing the angle when you point your toes downward. Okay. All right, so also movement of the foot, inversion and eversion. So essentially inversion, the sole of the foot turns medially, and eversion, the sole of the foot of your foot, it's going to face laterally. And again, it's always better to see it with a picture. So again, you see the inversion, the sole of the foot turns medially, and then eversion, the sole of the foot turns laterally. Okay. And then with movements in the transverse plane, protraction, like your lower jaw, you can move a little bit interior. You can also retract your lower jaw. So that's retraction, protraction, retraction. So that describes movement in the transverse plane. And it shows an example here with your lower jaw, your mandible, protraction moving forward, and then retraction of the mandible moving backwards. Okay. All right, so elevation and depression, again, those names pretty much tell you what they do. Lifting the body parts superiorly is elevation. Depression, moving your body parts inferiorly. So the jaw can also do elevation and depression. So here's an example: elevation, mandible moving upward, depressing, moving it downward. Okay, closing and opening your mouth essentially. So your opposition. So the saddle joint between the metacarpal and the trapezium allows movement called opposition of the thumb. So essentially this movement is taken when you touch your thumb to the tips of your other fingers on the same hand. So it is opposition that makes human hand such a fine tool for grasping and manipulating objects. Okay, so being able to do this opposition movements, all right, makes our hands very good for grasping and manipulating objects. All right, so we talked about these 6 types of shapes of articular surfaces, but let's go into more detail about each one in the next few slides. So let's talk about these 6 types of articular shapes of articular surfaces. All right. All right, so plane joints. So again, remember non-axial, you have gliding movements. So again, you find these between flat articular surfaces. So you see between flat articular surfaces. And again, you just have non-axial movement, gliding movement, and you find them in your intercarpal joints and your intertarsal joints. Okay? So again, between flat articular surfaces, you have gliding movements, which are non-axial joints, okay? All right, so we talked about the hinge joint. So that's an example of a uniaxial movement. So remember, uni means movement in one plane. So again, example of a hinge joint is between the humerus, and the ulna. Okay, humerus and ulna. So that allows for flexon, and extension only. Okay, so again, movement in one plane, uniaxial movement, movement in one plane. All right, so pivot joints are also uniaxial movement. Remember we talked about the ulna and radius. So when you go from supination to pronation, okay, when your palms up to your palms down, you radius is moving, it's rotating over the ulna. Okay, so remember we talked about pivots. As far as basketball, your pivot foot is the foot that stays on the floor, and you can lift up your other foot and move your other foot, but you can't move your pivot foot. And so essentially, when you go from your palms up to your palms down, okay, your radius is rotating over the ulna. Okay, so your ulna will be the pivot in that situation. All right, and again, that's uniaxial movement. All right. With condyloid joints, you have biaxial movement. So that's movement in 2 planes. So you're able to do flexion and extension, and also adduction and abduction. Okay, you have movement in 2 planes, and both articular surfaces are oval. Okay, and where you found these, a place where you find these are between your metacarpal phalangeal joints. Okay, your metacarpal phalangeal joints, you find there's condyloid joints. You find this biaxial movements. Okay, and these articular surfaces are oval. All right. With your saddle joints, okay, so this is again biaxial movement. So you have flexion, extension, adduction, and abduction. But the articular surfaces are both concave and convex. So you see how concave and convex, you see that? right there. Um, and you find these saddle joints at the carpal, metacarpal joints of the thumbs, and you kind of this this does look like a saddle. You see how this looks like a saddle, right? That does look like a saddle. Okay, so again, you find it at the carpal, metacarpal joints of the thumb. All right. So the ball and socket joint is a multi-axial joint, so you have movement in all three planes: flexion, extension, adduction, abduction, and rotation. Okay, so ball and socket joint of your shoulder is a good example, and also your hip joints is another example of multi-axial joints. Okay, and what you have is essentially a sphere, spherical head right here. Okay, then a cup-like socket. Okay, so that's the shapes of the articulating bones. Now let's talk about some common joint injuries. So sprains. With sprains, the ligaments reinforcing a joint are stretched or torn. Common sites of sprains are the ankle, the knee, and the lumbar region of the spine. Partially torn ligaments will repair themselves, but they heal slowly because ligaments are very poorly vascularized. And sprains tend to be painful and immobilizing. So again, partial tears will repair themselves slowly. Complete ruptures or complete tears requires surgical repair. With cartilage tears, so people who overdo various forms of exercise may feel a snap or pop of their overstretched cartilage. So the most common place where you get your cartilage injuries involve tearing of the knee meniscus, and but due to the popularity of sports nowadays, you do see more articular cartilages of other joints that are becoming damaged in younger athletes. So being that cartilage is avascular, meaning that it doesn't have a blood supply. When you end up with a cartilage tear, it's not going to repair itself. All right, it's going to stay torn because it doesn't have a blood supply. You need that blood supply to get the nutrients and the other cells that you need for repair to occur. So usually when you have a cartilage tear, the physician recommends arthroscopic surgery to remove the damaged cartilage. Okay. Dislocations occur when the bones are forced out of alignment. It's usually accompanied by sprains, inflammation, and difficulty in moving the joints. So they're usually the result of a serious fall or with contact sports. So common places that they occur: joints of the jaw, your shoulder joints, fingers, and thumbs are the most common dislocation. And subluxation is a partial dislocation of a joint. Okay, and then a full dislocation is luxation. All right, subluxation is just a partial dislocation of a joint. And again, usually a lot of times dislocations can be repeated in the same place. If you think about it, remember with a dislocation, you're going to stretch the joint capsule and ligaments. So that's going to make the loose capsule provides makes it easier for another dislocation to occur essentially. Bursitis is inflammation of a bursa, and it's usually caused by a blow or friction. So, for example, falling on one's knee may result in painful bursitis of the prepatellar bursa. You can also, you guys are students, and you might have a lot of prolonged leaning on one's elbow, and that might damage the bursa close to the olecranon. All right, and that can also cause bursitis of the elbow. So the way that you treat bursitis is you can inject the area, the bursa, with a anti-inflammatory drug. And if you have excess fluid, you can remove some of the fluid to relieve the pressure. Tendinitis is inflammation of the tendon sheaths, and that's typically caused by overuse. So again, symptoms could be pain and swelling, and treatment a lot of time is rest and ice, and also inflammatory drugs if necessary. All right, with arthritis, it's an inflammatory degenerative disease of the joints. There's over 100 different types of arthritis. The most widespread crippling disease of North America, and the initial symptoms are pain, stiffness, swelling of the joints. We are only going to discuss three clinical types of arthritis. Again, there's over 100. We're only going to discuss three. All right, so osteoarthritis, we already mentioned this. This is the most common chronic arthritis. It's again probably related to normal aging. So remember, in your joints you have your articular cartilage, and your articular cartilage, remember, that covers the ends of your bones in your joints. And your articular cartilage is hyaline cartilage. And again, over time, you can have, from wear and tear, you end up with more of that articular cartilage, more of that hyaline cartilage being worn away than being deposited, than being repaired and deposited. So you can end up with osteoarthritis. And again, it's painful, but it's the most common type, and it deals with the articular cartilage of your joints. Okay, that's the ends of your bones that are going to articulate with each other. They're covered with hyaline cartilage, and that hyaline cartilage wears away. Okay, and that's what causes osteoarthritis. And then you have rheumatoid arthritis. So rheumatoid arthritis is an autoimmune disease. So essentially, the immune system is going to attack the joints. So with rheumatoid arthritis, the symptoms begin with bilateral inflammation of certain joints. It usually arises between 30 and 50, and it tends to affect 3 times as many women as men. So it's not as common as osteoarthritis, but it affects millions of people, about 1% of all people. And usually rheumatoid arthritis leads to deformities. This next slide is an image of rheumatoid arthritis. So that's a picture of rheumatoid arthritis. You can see the deformities. So gouty arthritis. So this is the inflammation of joints caused by deposition of uric acid crystals from the blood. So usually diets high in red meat and red wine. So red meat and red wine, all right, the good stuff, a lot of times lead to gout, and it's more common in men, and usually it occurs in the big toe. And I've never experienced it, but I've heard it's extremely painful. And again, it usually occurs in the big toe, and usually people who have diets, men who have diets of a lot of red meat and red wine, tend to have more inflammations of gout. Okay, more common in men. This last slide is showing the fetal primary ossification centers. So remember, in the fetal, when a baby's a fetus or an embryo, fetus essentially, it's going to be made, the bone's going to be made out of hyaline cartilage. Then over time, they're going to ossify. So this is just showing you some ossification centers okay, of a fetus at 12 weeks. All right, so that ends our lecture on chapters 6, 7, and 8. I will change the date on the quiz. A lot of students have already taken chapter 6, 7, and 8 lecture quiz, but I would change it for Tuesday evening. So that should give you plenty of time to take it for the ones who have not taken it. So Tuesday evening would be, let me just see how many months, how many days are in March. So Tuesday would be March the 31st, okay? So I'm going to make the due date for that lecture, chapter 6, 7, 8 quiz, March 31st, and we'll just say 6 o'clock, okay? All right. Thank you.